What's up, everybody? Hey, what's up? Waiting for people to show up. Talking about the same stuff as I have been the past few days. Today, I am talking about whether moral realism is true or not. Happy to talk about other stuff too, though. Hey, how's it going? While we're waiting for people to request, so you should request if you disagree with the main thing there. In fact, I'll switch it back to the other one. We'll do all the topics. I won't be lazy. How do I change it in the middle? Hey, people showing up. I am looking to see how I change my background. How do I do that in the middle of it? I don't know how, so I guess we'll leave it for now. I'm still trying to figure out the UI in here. What's up? I can do this, though. What's up? I guess I'm visible now. All right, so if you disagree with this, if you think that there are objective moral facts, facts about what's morally right or wrong, then go ahead and request, come up and talk to me. While we're waiting for more people to request, I'm happy to take questions in the chat. So, my whole thing is, I've been telling people the past week since I just started. I just started on, was it Monday or Tuesday? I don't remember which day. Finally got enough followers to start doing this. I was over on Danny on Phil Talk's channel talking about this kind of stuff, other stuff, problem of evil, free will, different sorts of topics. So I've got a background in philosophy and psychology, and one of the big things that I like to talk about is whether there are objective moral facts. So in the academic literature, these days that tends to be called moral realism. So that is the view that there are, to use the technical terminology, stance independent moral facts. So what does that mean? That means that there are facts about what's morally right or wrong, or good or bad, facts about what you should or shouldn't do and how you should live your life, morally speaking, that are true regardless of your values or anyone else's values. It doesn't depend on, it's not made true by your preferences, your desires, your goals, nor is it made true by the standards of your culture. It's not like if your culture thinks something is good, then that makes it good. Rather, it's good independent. Whatever it is that's good is good independent of your culture or you or anybody else. In the same way that you might think of, the facts about, like, on the periodic table. So how many protons are in a carbon atom? That there is going to be, some fact of the matter about that. And it's not made true by your preferences. And that's in contrast to facts that are made true by your preferences. Facts like whether you like ice cream. So, if you say something like, ice cream tastes good, and what you mean by that is that you find that it tastes good, then you're making a claim about your own preferences. And then whether that claim is true or false turns on your preferences. So there are some facts are made true by your preferences, and then, at least I think so, some people would disagree. There might even be gastronomic realists out there that think there's objective facts about what food is good or bad. But assuming you don't go that far, there are clearly facts that are made true by our preferences and our desires, and then there's other facts that don't appear to be made true by our preferences and desires. And then the debate comes down to, which one is morality like? Is it more like the preferences desires one? Is it more that it's made true by preferences? Or is it more that it's made true by something else? Doesn't mean that you have to pick one of those. Maybe you have a more nuanced view. Maybe you think it's a false dichotomy. Maybe you think it's a little bit of both. But generally in philosophy, people fall on one or the other side. So, I don't see anybody asking questions in the chat, so I'll ask you, do you think most philosophers are moral realists or moral anti-realists? Because we actually have survey data on this. I've talked about it a bit, but does anyone happen to know? One person says, I think most are realists. Another person says, I guess, realist, but I don't know. Another says anti. Somebody says 60-something%. So 60-something percent, but realists or anti-realists? Because that is right. We do have survey data from the 2020 Phil Paper survey. So it looks like people are given a variety of answers. I'm not seeing unanimity in the audience. So that's an interesting point. Code says most mathematicians believe numbers are real. So I don't. I mean, there's a sense in which they're like clearly real. I could point at someone could draw 4, and I could point at that. But I don't think numbers have like some special ontological status. But yeah, I think a lot of mathematicians do so. But I don't know why I think that. I don't know what that's based on, and I don't know if I've seen survey data on that. Logan says most philosophers. I'm assuming you mean philosophers. Most philosophers I've talked to are anti-realists. Another person says in all caps, realist. That was the one that said something about the percentage. Okay, so the answer is that most philosophers, at least according to the one big survey that's been done on this, are moral realists, not moral anti-realists. So that survey is what's called the 2020 Phil Papers survey. The reason there's that name, that 2020 on it, they also did another one back in 2009, and maybe they'll do another one in 10 years or so. You might wonder, why don't they just do a survey every year? People can get survey fatigue, and when it's a relatively small community, if you survey people year after year after year, and the survey has, I think this time it had over 100 questions on it, people will just get tired of it and will stop doing it. And you don't want to have that attrition where people just stop doing the survey because they're doing it so frequently. So I think it's a good idea to put a solid... I like the idea of them doing it at 2020 and then doing it in 10-year intervals. So we had 2030, 2040. Who knows? If we get artificial general intelligence and we get some existential risk and it wipes out human civilization, then we won't even be here to know which direction philosophers go in. But I will tell you. In fact, actually, I'll ask another quiz question for the audience. I don't know, maybe today it's trivia day. So today, with the 2020 Phil Paper survey, they found that 62% of the respondents to the survey, at least the ones that answered that question, lean towards or accepted moral realism. 62%. We also have data on specialization, like areas of specialization. About 13% of the respondents to the survey said that they specialized in metaethics. And of those, 65% favored moral realism. So it didn't really change very much. It went up a tiny, tiny amount. But do you happen to know what the results were from 2009? So again, the 2020 results, and not for the specialists, I mean for philosophers in general. The total number that responded to the survey that favored moral realism in 2020 was 62%. What was the percentage in 2009? So guessing the actual percentage might be a little hard. So do you think it was less or was it more? In other words, has belief in moral realism appears to have increased or decreased since that? Of course, numbers aren't always noisy when you survey people. It doesn't mean that if the number is smaller or larger that there was a genuine increase in the population. But we at least have the statistics that we gathered. The number is different. Is it smaller or larger? I see one person said decreased. So Bear Club asks, did they divide theist philosophers from atheists? So what I'm reporting, that 62% is the total number, and that includes both theists and atheists. However, they also have a bunch of other questions, and if you Google 2020 Phil Paper survey, you can find all the results for the survey, and it will give you the demographic data, the breakdown of the nation of where the philosopher was when they filled out. I think it's where they were when they filled out the survey or where they're currently working. So you could get all that information. You could also get their answers to the other questions, and you could cross-reference them against one another. So they have all these tables, and one of those tables is showing, basically it's like a 2x2 table that shows you atheists that are realists, atheists that are anti-realists, theists that are realists, and theists that are anti-realists. So you can control for it. That same survey showed that about, I think it's 70 or is it 80%? I think it's 70% are atheists. And then you have like 15 or 20% theists, and then a bunch of other people I think picked other stuff. You could go double check that. I don't remember the exact number on that, but it's a significant majority are atheists. So the majority are atheists and the majority are moral realists. And if you control for the theist, all the theists in the survey, I think only about 15% of them were anti-realists. But that might be surprising because they're theists. So basically, if you don't count the theists, the majority are still realists. So even if you look only at atheist philosophers, they're still mostly moral realists. So several people said decreased. It did not decrease. So in 2009 it was 56%, and in 2020 it was 62%. So it went up about 6%. And again, take that with a grain of salt. There could be differences in the populations they happen to survey or other sorts of factors. You're always going to get noise and variation in these kind of surveys. So somebody says something about how, if there's no morals and ethics, then we should just do. I'm not going to describe the terrible things that they mention. I never know what you can say on TikTok. But I belief in moral anti-realism is not a belief that there's no such thing as morals and ethics. For comparison, I'm an anti-realist about gastronomic realism. I don't think there's objective facts about what food is good or bad, or, is it objectively true that some types of whiskey are better than other types of whiskey? I don't think so. I think it's a matter of preference. So I'm a gastronomic anti-realist. That doesn't mean I think food doesn't taste good or bad. That'd be ridiculous. So, it's an unfortunate fact of history that the position is called anti-realism, as if we think morality isn't real, and that's not really what it is. It's the view that there are no stance-independent moral facts, facts about what's morally right or wrong that are true independent of our goals, standards, or values. Anyway, so this is like a request thing. So if you want a request to come up and talk to me, if you disagree with this, if you think there are objective moral truths, feel free to request, and I'd be happy to talk to you. Oh, right. One person says, I think as people continue to be exposed to different cultures via the internet, it will decrease. I think it's a pretty plausible hypothesis. You could look at this great paper from 2011 from Sarkisian et al. I think it's Sarkisian, Nobe, I can't remember who else is on the paper. It's a really cool research paper, and what they did in that paper is they presented people with disagreements. And the way that they did it is like this. So, first, you get a disagreement between yourself and like a member of your, I think this was done with college students, it was like somebody from your college. And they said, okay, so you hold this view, this other person disagrees with your moral view. So let's say they ask you about whether abortion is right or wrong. And you say whatever it is you say about it. And they say, okay, well, there's this other person, they hold a contrary view, and they're from your university, they're from your same culture. And then they asked the participants to basically judge how much they agreed that, given their conflict, at least one of them had to be mistaken about whether abortion was right or wrong. And then people would give a certain proportion of them would, lean more towards giving saying they could both be correct, and a certain proportion would lean more towards saying at least one of them would have to be mistaken. And judging that at least one of them would have to be mistaken is interpreted as something closer to a realist view. Now, what happens is that you get a certain proportion chose realism, but they then had two other conditions. In the next condition, they told them about people that live in a remote society that is culturally very different from the participants' own society. And there, the realist response rates, like people responding, giving like the realist response. And the reason I'm saying the realist response, not that they are realists, is because I'm very skeptical that these studies are accurately capturing whether people really are realists or not. Anyway, the realist response dropped. And then they gave a third example of a moral disagreement between the participant and somebody else. You know what? Now I'm thinking, was it the participant or was it a member of their culture? I can't recall if it was done in the first person or the third person. It could be the participant and somebody else, or it could be a member of their culture and then another member of their culture, so like two members of the same culture, one member of their culture, and a member of a very different human society. But then in the third example, whichever it was, first person or third person, I wish I remembered all the exact details. I always forget the little details. So then the third version, they presented them with an extraterrestrial civilization. And this one, they got a little silly with it. They're called pentars. And the pentars don't care about happiness or suffering or doing anything that humans normally care about. The only thing that pentars care about is converting all matter in the universe into equilateral pentagons. So a pentagon, exactly 5 sides that are of equal length. And the only thing pentars care about is doing that. And then they gave them these same issues, and then the realist response rates dropped even further. And so, at least in those cases, the authors argue that people tend to be less likely to give realist responses when the cultural divergence between two people who disagree about a moral issue is made salient. That is, it's like clear. It's like in their mind, they're considering, oh, okay. So if they're from the same culture, lower rates of rejecting realism, and if it's a more like a more different culture, then even like lower rates of realism, and then if they're very different, then even lower rates of realism. There's been subsequent criticism of that article. I've written a little bit of criticism about it. Other people have too. I still think it's a very cool article. See, I am not seeing any requests, so do feel free to request if you are a moral realist and you think that there are objective moral facts and you want to talk about it. Okay. Let's see what else people have to say. All right. I see someone saying he's an atheist agnostic. I don't know if you're talking about me, but I am an atheist as well. Have you found some good arguments for moral realism? So, it's often the philosophically humble thing to say is, oh, the people on the other side have good arguments for their view. This is a case where I don't think that that's the case. I don't think that there are any good arguments for moral realism. I've never encountered any. I don't think that that means that if someone is a moral realist, they must be irrational. I don't think that means that you should be rude and condescending towards people that are moral realists. I don't think any of that. I think that I come at these issues from a metaphilosophically very different perspective than proponents of moral realism, at least in the academic literature. And if one of us is making a mistake, I think it's on more fundamental grounds, like maybe I have a flawed epistemology or something like that, and that my disbelief in moral realism and my confidence in that disbelief is downstream of that. And so it could be that it's extremely reasonable for them to hold a contrary metaphilosophy to me. I don't think so. Obviously, if I thought it was that reasonable, then I wouldn't be so confident that they were mistaken, and I might not even hold the views that I do. But, when it actually comes to considering the sort of arguments on the ground, like if you get into the philosophical trenches and you look at the arguments that people give for moral realism, I don't find them even remotely persuasive, like not even a little bit. I do have a video with Kane B where we rank all of the, well, not all, we rank a lot of the main arguments for moral realism. And I might say a bit about that, but I'm hoping that I'll get a request and I'll be able to talk to somebody. So if that sounds very confident to you, overconfident, maybe I'm overconfident. I don't think that I am. I actually think the arguments are not very good. For comparison, I do think that arguments, so I'm an atheist, and by that I really do mean I don't believe gods exist, like any of them. I'm not agnostic. I don't know if gods exist or not. So sometimes people will say I'm an agnostic atheist. I think it's a little bit awkward terminology. I'm not really opposed to it though. I get where people are coming from with that, but I believe gods don't exist. But I'm not so confident about that I would go around, like I'm not as confident about that as I am that there aren't really any good accounts of moral realism. So there, just to give you a sense of where it falls for me, it's like lower than that. Another example. So I don't think Bigfoot exists. I've always loved cryptozoology. I think it's really interesting. I do think that I've never seen any good evidence for any like cryptid, like these mysterious creatures that supposedly like a Loch Ness monster and the Bigfoot, and I don't know, maybe other examples of cryptids. I don't think there's any good evidence for any of them, so I'm very skeptical of all of this, but there's something about it that I find interesting. Like I like the idea that Bigfoot is out there. Now, that being said, I think the probability that Bigfoot exists is extremely low, but I do think it's higher than that there's some compelling, non-trivial account of moral realism that's true. So it's very low down. But that doesn't mean that I think it's impossible. There might be certain accounts of moral realism that are literally impossible if they have a logical contradiction or they're unintelligible. But I wouldn't say that I know that all accounts are unintelligible. I think that'd be a wild overreach. Okay. So this is a great question. At least I like it. Do you think sexiness realism as a parody would be a good counter to moral realism rhetorically? I don't know if that in particular would be a good counter to moral realism rhetorically. I do know that there was a Less Wrong post. I don't know if you know Less Wrong is a community blog from the rationality community. It's associated with like artificial intelligence and stuff these days. That's a common topic there. So there was one blog post at least where they were talking about how like in these like old pulp science fiction movies, monsters, like aliens from another planet would come to the Earth and they would like kidnap women as if they would find human women beautiful. And that's obviously us projecting our own beauty standards onto extraterrestrial organisms, which is absurd because they wouldn't share the same preferences and judgments as us. But there are people that are aesthetic realists. So sexiness probably falls pretty close to aesthetic realism. So here's a question for you. On that same survey, the 2020 Phil Paper survey, I got a request. So I'll finish up this point, then we'll take the request. On that 2020 Phil Paper survey, they did ask about aesthetic objectivism, whether there are objective facts about what's beautiful or not, or aesthetically good or bad. Does anyone happen to know the results for that? So I will give you the answer. The answer for aesthetic objectivism, which is pretty similar to moral realism, was 40%. And the number that rejected that was actually less than 40%. I think there were three major, I think there's a lot of people that chose like other, and there's a bunch of options in other. So the most common position was some type of aesthetic realism among philosophers. So if you think that it's surprising or implausible, like if you think moral realism is implausible and you're surprised that most philosophers are moral realists, the number that are also aesthetic realists, it's not most philosophers, but it's almost half. 40% is a lot. So I find that shocking. I think aesthetic realism is, if I'm being honest, deep. Like I'll say I find it extremely implausible. I find it remarkable that it would be 40%. Okay, let's check out this guest request. Oh no, I did not charge my phone. I don't know how long I'm going to be able to stick around here. I also see a whole bunch of messages. You don't make any.
Hi, Lance.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good. Do you disagree with this up here, or did you want to talk about other stuff?
Well, so I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I saw no one was requesting, so I kind of wanted to pick your brain about a few things if you would want to do that.
Cool. Okay. Appreciate it. Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, cool. I also just started following you this week. I saw you do a live with Danny, who I've been following for a couple months, and I thought his lives were pretty impressive and interesting. And then you were doing one with him. I think it was on Easter actually, and I was like, wow, this is a great chat too. So I gave you a follow, and I've been enjoying your content. So
appreciate it. Thank you.
That. Yeah. One thing I heard you mention a little earlier that I wanted to ask you about was you thought the terminology for somebody explaining themselves as a agnostic atheist is a little clunky. I think that is a pretty clear way to define oneself. Why do you think it's clunky?
Two words. It's not that it's that clunky. So, if you're going by the standard distinctions that one might give, it's not that hard to see why someone would use both. So here would be the standard way I would frame it. Agnosticism is about knowledge.
Yep.
Atheism versus theism is about belief. So there's a separate question about what you are in a position to know and a separate question about what you're in a position to believe. And so you could say that I believe God doesn't exist, but I don't know that God doesn't exist. And so going by those definitions, belief, God doesn't exist. Boom, you're in the atheist box. Knowledge, do you know God exists or doesn't exist? No, agnostic. So it's a pretty simple way to categorize people. But ideally, we wouldn't have to have two terms. That's basically it.
Yeah. I define it that exact way too. And usually when I come across in real life, like talking about those two terms, that's how I boil it down. So that makes sense. What do you think of the idea of atheism as a title just kind of being silly in general? One way I like to talk about this is, it's very unusual to define yourself in a way, in something that you don't believe in, right? So like, you're not a non-alchemist. Nobody's a non-alchemist, or nobody's a non-fairy believer or something like that. But I can see there being practical use in, I don't know, in a religious context, defining yourself as an atheist. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't find anything silly about it at all. So at all. Why am I skipping over words? So the reason I don't find it silly at all is that the labels that we use for ourselves emerge in social contexts. And so if we were in a society where a lot of people believe in God and we don't, it would make sense to have a label for that, especially if the label is very sociologically important. Like if it influences whether people would want to have relationships with us, what kind of communities that we're part of, whether we go to church or not, whether we're willing to swear in a Bible or not, what kind of burial ritual we want. Like there are so many aspects of our lives in which one's religious beliefs potentially impinge on and influence the way that we go about what we do, like what jewelry people wear, what music they listen to. There's so many aspects that if you're opting out of those traditions or and of course an atheist can still participate in it. I celebrate Christmas, I don't care. But if you're opting out of some or all of those, or you don't share the same beliefs as other people, that's an important thing potentially to signify in a particular culture. So,
Yeah.
the utility of a label exists against a backdrop of the kind of society that you live in. And if I pitch this as a hypothetical for the obvious fact that like it would be useful to do it if you were in that society. We are in a society like that, so it is useful. If we were living, if it's like 10,000 years from now, and it's like Star Trek or something, I don't think Star Trek is actually 10,000 years in the future. I mean, like if it's a Star Trek future that's kind of post religion or something, maybe we would drop the label, and it would be weird. People were like, oh yeah, people used to call themselves atheists,
Hmm.
back in the day. Like they used to actually have to go out of their way to say that they don't believe in God or something.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good perspective. I appreciate that. It's a good way to look at it. Um, well, I guess to more of your lives question here, there is no objective moral truth.
Hmm.
I think I do mostly agree with you on that, but I guess where I kind of fall short on it when I start to really think about it or talk about it, um, I can't foresee a situation where we'll ever find or discover, a philosophical truth to a question like that. There's no moral gene or something like that I think we can find. Um, but I think that discussion starts to get more and more difficult when people ask, like, well, what do you ground your morals in, or how do you value something, or how do you get the ought from an is? And once the conversation starts to go in that direction, I start having more and more difficulty having that conversation. Where do you find yourself starting that conversation if somebody brings that up?
It usually depends on the context. So different people are going to say different things. Like some people will conflate the idea of rejecting moral realism with rejecting the idea of being moral at all. Like you can't have morality if you don't have moral realism. You don't have objective moral truth. I usually try to give them comparisons to things where I suspect that they will not be realists, but they're also normative. That is, they involve evaluations about what's good or bad or right or wrong or what you should or shouldn't do. And my standard go-to is gastronomy. So, you might have just heard me if you were in earlier in the live, where, when it comes to going, if you go and you look at the food on a menu, some of the food you like, some of the food you might not like. So, you have your preferences, and there's food that you think would be good, and food that you think would be bad. There's food that you think I should eat that, I shouldn't eat that, but none of that I think in any way implies or entails, and I don't think the way that we speak about food even hints at there being objective facts about what's good or bad food or what food you should or shouldn't eat. There's a great paper on this. So someone had mentioned like sexiness realism as a kind of way of like a parody for satirizing realism.
Yeah.
And maybe that would work. But I think a better one is gastronomic realism. So the idea that there would be objective facts about what food is good or bad. So, like, caviar is objectively better than tofu. That would be like one silly proposal that one might have. And if you work through the implications of what that would look like in practice, it'd be pretty weird. Now, I should say, I didn't come up with this idea. There is a phenomenal paper by this philosopher, Don Loeb, called Gastronomic Realism, A Cautionary Tale. It is one of the things I love about the paper is he like brings up his kids and like trying to convince them to eat fish, and he's like, no, but you don't understand. Fish is objectively good, so you should eat it, like objectively tasty. So it has a lot of jokes. It's a lot of fun. But the
Yeah.
point there is think about what that would be like. So you're trying to decide what to eat, and you
Yeah.
have your preferences, and we're setting aside questions of nutrition and ethics. Like assume the food is equally ethically sourced, it costs the same amount of money, it has the same. Hold all that constant. There's just the difference in what the food tastes like, and you're
Hmm.
deciding between two options. And one of them, you enjoy the taste more, and you know you'll enjoy the taste more. In fact, let's say you took a bite out of both, and now you have to decide which one to completely eat. Now, one of them is the one that you prefer the taste of, and the other, that there are objective gastronomic facts, and it is actually objectively better. Let's say it's caviar. Caviar is fancy, so maybe it's objectively better. But you hate it; it tastes terrible. If I were deliberating about what to do, I would choose the one that tastes better. I wouldn't choose the one that's objectively better. Who cares if it's objectively better? So I try to give people analogies like that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good one. You know, I don't know what your opinion is of these two, and I'm not sure if you even know them. There's a philosopher YouTube channel, Cosmic Skeptic, Alex O'Connor. he just had a
Hmm.
long discussion that he posted with Sam Harris, and they went over Sam Harris's moral landscape and all that. And a lot of that conversation, Alex, broke down into kind of what you were just saying. It ultimately comes down to preference, and I don't actually ever really think they had a meeting of the minds in that conversation. But it seems like what Alex's position boiled down to mostly was that it seems like, Sam, your distinction here, that we can find objective moral truths, but you're kind of just insinuating that people have preferences ultimately, and you can't really actually find any, I don't know, grounding in a preference difference. It's hard to
Hmm.
articulate, but that kind of what that conversation boiled down to for me. Um, yeah,
I have only watched the first maybe 10 or 15 minutes of that, and
yeah,
I've been talking with a few people because it's an important video to address. So Alex O'Connor used to be called Cosmic Skeptic. He's recently rebranded by dropping that Cosmic Skeptic label.
yeah. Within
I'm
reason
assuming
now,
you're,
I think he has it called.
well, maybe that's the name of like what he's calling his official podcast, but I think his branding is largely just Alex O'Connor. Is
Okay,
it
okay.
not?
You might be
Uh,
right. You might be right.
yeah. So and I like that rebranding. That's
Yeah,
I'm
same, same. It's not so edge lord.
right, exactly. And I'm not using my actual name, although I'm easy enough to find. My name is Lance Bush, but I use Lance Independent. So I don't know if that's good branding because I'm like, it's kind of a branding name, but then also it does include my first name at least. So I don't know.
I think it's good.
Um, yeah, I don't know if you noticed it because I mentioned this a couple times. Sometimes people, even people that have backgrounds in philosophy, don't notice the pun right away. But notice the terminology I used. Moral realism is the view that there are stance independent moral facts. Stance independent, Lance independent.
Oh,
That's where it
okay.
comes
I
from.
gotcha. Yeah, I like that. That's good.
So,
Um,
well, it wasn't my idea. Somebody gave me the idea. I still need to ask them, hey, should I be shouting you out for such a good idea? But if they want to shout it on my web pages, I'll put it on there. Right. So I haven't listened to that conversation,
yeah,
and I had initially started listening to it. And I'm like, I'm going to do a review. So actually, I'll just use this as an opportunity. So I just started here on TikTok this week. My main thing, I've been on there for a couple of years now, is YouTube, and I mostly stream. I also do interviews, debates, and discussions, but I mostly stream. And one of the big things I do on Mondays is I call it Meta Monday. And I'm just trying to go through the whole catalog of every single video on moral realism on YouTube. And I'm going to
yeah.
review them all. So I review them, I critique them. And I just started doing that a few weeks ago. I have a bunch of critiques already of stuff out there, but that's like I formalized the project now. So my goal is to critique every video on YouTube, all of them. There's I don't know, I think it's at least a couple hundred. So I got a lot of work to do.
Well,
So
that's cool. You should definitely review that Alex O'Connor and Sam Harris one. I would definitely watch that.
yeah, so it's a big video. So
Yeah.
if there's a 20-minute video, I'll do 2 hours reviewing it because I end up
Okay,
saying a
okay.
lot. I'm very verbose. It has its upsides, it has its downsides for sure. So the thing about that one is I've been talking to a few people, and we might be organizing a much larger sort of review because Sam Harris is a fairly high profile figure, maybe not as high profile as he was 10 or 15 years ago in the like
Hmm.
atheism heyday.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
and he put out the moral landscape I think in 2010. So it's almost 15 years, and I didn't like the book. I didn't like it. I thought it was. Part of the problem is I'm not really sure what Sam. I think Sam's arguments are so unclear. It's hard to even know how to respond to them, and I find that really frustrating because he's had now almost 15 years to clarify. And from the
Yeah,
first few minutes of the video, Alex went over his tweets, like his hot stove argument,
yeah.
and it doesn't make sense. I don't think it makes sense.
Where do you think it doesn't make sense, or where do you think he is? I don't know, not being clear enough. Because
It's
I don't
hard to
disagree
even
with
begin.
you. I
Like
don't disagree with you.
what you would have to do. So it's the sort of thing where if I gave you 10 sentences in a row and they were all like non sequiturs, they weren't even connected to one another, but they kind of look like it, you would just be like, what did I just hear? That's what that whole tweet thread, it's like thread of tweets, it's like 10 tweets. It's like a bunch of non sequiturs and disconnected ideas. And it doesn't like, it's hard. You have to look at it on paper and
Hmm.
systematically break it down to look at why it doesn't make sense. And it is, it's a lot of work. So I feel
Yeah,
like it's going to take a lot more work to break that down. I don't know what's going on there. I don't know why Harris is fabulously unclear about this
yeah.
argument and appears to be completely oblivious to the fact that he's fabulously unclear about it.
Well, I think
I
I
don't get
think
it.
what you're gonna I think what you're gonna find the more you watch that video is that Alex kind of pokes at that a little bit more and more, how he's like never really arriving at a conclusion or supporting his claims enough. And I never actually found them to be in agreement on that point, even though Sam seems to really try to explain himself in 100 different ways. I think you will be slightly more satisfied though the more you watch that video. That I think that this will be the best example of him needing to defend his arguments. But I don't know. Maybe you'll come to a different conclusion after you watch it. But it's definitely worth it.
We'll see. I think Alex is doing a fantastic. I don't know what he did, but he like massively leveled up in his
Yes,
conversation
one
game.
hundred
I
percent. Yeah,
it's like he's like, okay, I'm gonna rebrand and I'm gonna get serious. And he like when he's done his TV appearances, I think he's been
yeah,
spot on. He has good comebacks. He's quick, and he wasn't always quite as polished in his public discussions. I've seen him, make what I thought were mistakes or avoidable issues, and he just got way better. But at the same time, I also think, and I think it's a right move for him, is he's not pushing people so hard that they don't like it, at
yeah,
least
yeah.
as far
No,
as
he
I've seen.
keeps it conversational. He keeps it
Right,
conversational.
yeah. And so I think he's doing a phenomenal job. I don't think I could do that good of a job. I think I would either get frustrated with people and want to hold their feet to the fire more. So I'm
Yeah.
guessing that he doesn't really do that with Sam Harris. Like he gives enough of a push, but not too much. I mean, there was that Peter Hitchens discussion though, and that I don't think that was his fault at all. I don't know
No,
what
no,
was
not at
going on
all.
there.
Not at all. I agree. What do you think of how do you find his, I don't know, his philosophical acumen or argumentation? Do you find it to be like impressive, or how do you think of him as as a
Alex or
philosopher?
Harris?
Alex, or both
So
actually, but we can start with Alex.
so I don't watch enough of his content to really be able to assess his views on the matter. So I just don't know. Um, I like the only thing I could say is I think he said he's a non-cognitivist a few times in passing, but I've never heard him make any sort of sustained argument for that or discuss it in detail. And you get that sort of like Gelman's amnesia type thing where I will understand topics in my own areas of competence or expertise and be able
Hmm.
to spot issues there. But as soon as you move outside of them, suddenly I just totally forget like that I don't actually know anything outside of the areas that I understand. So I'm just not in a position to assess his stuff yet. I mean, I've mostly so since I started watching his new content, I'm mostly looking at the dynamics of how he navigates those discussions, and he's
Yeah.
largely letting the other person do the talking, like with William Lane Craig. And a lot of what he's doing is set up to get them to say more. So I haven't seen him developing his views and articulating them in some fleshed out way recently. So I just couldn't assess
Okay.
um, Alex very well. I do think if he said he's a non-cognitivist, it would be a good reason for me to talk to him at some point if he's up for it. I'm not. I mean, he's pulling like all the heavyweights. So I don't know why he'd talk to me, but I would love to talk to him because I don't have a huge problem personally with someone saying I'm an error theorist, I'm a non-cognitivist, I'm a subjectivist, but I reject all of those positions, and I think that there is a better, there's like a better way of approaching being an anti-realist than picking one of the sort of standard labels. So that's what I'll say about Alex for now, which is like my focus is just going to be on meta-ethics and the meta-discourse. As far as meta-discourse, I think he's doing great. As far as his views on meta-ethics, I just don't know enough about them.
Sure,
As far as
sure.
Sam Harris, I'm not going to get into Sam Harris's takes on everything, just his stuff on the moral landscape. Um, I have the impression that Sam Harris has read work in metaethics and then didn't like it. Now, on the one hand, I don't blame him. I don't like it much either. I don't think even us people that do metaethics like it very much. I feel like the field has become it sort of tied itself up in technical pretzels in a way where it's not fun or enjoyable, and it's refreshing when people write more accessible work. I can say, and this is a book that I disagreed with both of the authors very strongly there, but I still have I'm critical of the book, very critical, but there's lots of positive things to say. So if you're looking for a fresh new take on the metaethics debate, like what we're talking about here, check out Is Morality Real from Spencer Case and Matt Lutz. They just put that book out like in the last year or two, like super duper recently. One of them is a moral realist and the other is an error theorist, so a moral anti-realist. And they both make their cases and then they have a back and forth. And that's a cool book. But as far as Sam Harris's take, the moral landscape I think that most of it is just a bunch of stuff talking about science of well-being. I don't have much to say about that. Whatever. It's just that I think he skips over actually making a substantive argument. One of my biggest issues is that Harris doesn't seem to engage with any of the substantive arguments for or against moral realism and anti-realism in the literature beyond a what looked to me like a pretty slapdash engagement with the is ought gap. That it seemed like he didn't have a good take on that at all. Um,
Hmm.
and then he just sort of skips over a lot of stuff. Like he doesn't like this idea that morality is about well-being. It seems like he's almost making this armchair a prioristic, like it's got to be about that. And it's like, look, it's something is about something else is a little weird. Like, okay, would you agree with this statement? And this, it's a little bit of a trick question, and it almost doesn't answer which way you answer. It almost doesn't matter which way you answer because I
Okay.
can make my point anyway. But is dinner about eating food?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So is it only about eating food?
No.
What else is it about?
I don't know. Usually it could be about having a meal with others.
There you go.
Uh,
Bingo.
yeah.
Socializing. That's one factor. It could be about other stuff. You could have dinners to like, maybe nobility back in the day had dinners to show off how wealthy they are. You can have additional motives beyond eating. So
Yeah.
the statement dinner is about eating is vague. Does it mean dinner is only about eating or that dinner is primarily about eating or one of the things dinner is about is eating? It's not clear. So when Sam Harris says that morality is about well-being, does he mean that morality is exclusively about well-being? Because he'll say like, "Oh, it's got to be about well-being. It's got to be about well-being." Okay, well there are people that care about well-being. Or if we understand well-being to be like positive psychological states, happiness, flourishing, living a good life. Okay, I'll flag that as one issue because there's an issue with the way that Sam Harris talks about well-being. So you have that on the one hand. And then on the other, okay, so let's say one of the things morality is about is well-being, but people also care about, for instance, the distribution of positive and negative outcomes in life. So, the people, if you had the option, in fact, let me ask you this. Let's say you have three kids and
Okay.
you can distribute units of happiness to your children, right? So you give them the food they need, the resources, you put money in their college funds, all that stuff. And you have two options. So out of your three kids, you can give them 10 units of good, 10 units of good, and 10. And let's say five is the minimum to be considered a good parent. So 10, 10, and 10, or let's say 30, 1, and 1. How would you distribute your resources?
10, 10, and 10.
Okay, well, 10, 10, and 10 adds up to,
30,
how about 30, 1, and 1? What's that add up to?
33.
Well, 32, right?
32. Sorry. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, it's all
I
good.
misunderstood.
So it's a higher amount. So why wouldn't you give 30, 1, and 1?
No,
Because it's
that's
a
a good
higher total
distinction to
amount
make.
sorry?
That's a really good distinction to make, even though it's more in total. But I would view the splitting of it evenly as the I don't know the moral optimal choice.
And there might be a trade off, right? Because if I said you could do 5, 5, and 5, or 30, 20, and 10, which one would you pick?
Mm. Well, 30, 20, and 10,
But it's not evenly split.
right?
So, so you see, there's a trade off between the total amount of good that you could do and the distribution of the good that you can do. So when Sam Harris says that morality is about well being, okay, it's about well being. Okay, what about well being? About maximizing it or how one distributes it or some complicated trade off of both? I don't know because he doesn't tell us. So Sam,
Yeah.
I think even when we get into his normative ethics is so vague and underdeveloped that it would make like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham like just cringe. They go, dude, there's a lot more to say here than what you're saying. And
Yeah.
they had much more, just phenomenally more robust accounts, like decades and decades and decades ago. So, what is Harris doing? He's not making any headway over classic utilitarian accounts that did a better job of handling criticisms, of making a positive case for their views, and all of this like over a century ago. So, what is he doing?
I
Like, it's,
if I could answer
yeah,
that question, I would probably, and this is just my experience with Sam Harris over the last few years. He was kind of a pretty, well, not few years at this point, it's like more than 10. He was kind of a gateway into the atheist movement for myself back when I was in college. I think he just kind of serves as a public individual who I find to be pretty eloquent and can introduce individuals to these concepts and these thoughts, but maybe doesn't have the ability or doesn't have the the capability to explain these things in great depth, but gives like a good kind of appetizer to a lot of these subjects. And it could be political, it can be religious, it can be atheistic, it can be, you could go down the line. But I wouldn't I wouldn't be so quick to blame him to not be able to defend himself to the extent that somebody who studies this one thing 100%. I don't know. I guess that's how I would kind of answer that
Maybe.
question.
I think that's being a little too charitable.
Yeah.
With respect, I feel like he's had more than enough time and opportunity to really develop better arguments, broader arguments, more robust arguments, to engage with the literature more. Um, you know, uh,
Certainly on the moral landscape point, I would agree with you. Just because he's written a book on it, and he hasn't seemed to I don't know, flesh
oh,
it out or unpack it a lot more than he already has. So I agree with you on that for sure. Well, look, Lance,
yeah, and
I don't want to take up your live too much more. I just
oh, sure.
I, I I find your content to be super interesting and engaging, and I wanted to have a conversation with you since um, nobody was requesting. So I appreciate your time, and I'm definitely going to be tuning in a lot more, and maybe I'll have some more
Awesome.
questions in the future.
Appreciate it. Thank you. I will move on to the next guest and
Yeah,
take
for
care.
sure.
All right. See you later.
See ya.
All right. So next up we have Anders. How's it going?
Oh, yo, what's up? How are you?
Doing all right. Sorry, I'm trying to charge my phone and I'm trying to balance it and it's wobbling all over the place.
Oh, yeah. On the
No.
charger, like throws it off balance. I know that. But
Okay. We'll see if it'll stay. If I suddenly disappear, it's because my phone fell over. How's it going?
yeah, it's going pretty good. Earlier you did say something about error theory and how you disagree with it.
Hmm.
I want to say that I disagree with it as well, but I think the reason that I disagree with it is more so for maybe a lack of understanding. Like, I don't think I know exactly what error theorists are getting at when they say that all propositions are false or all moral propositions are false. Is it like really just a semantic thesis, or are they going for something um, more committed than that, or are they actually just saying that people are making error in language?
Well, we can address this in a couple ways. I could just directly address your question, but we could also start with you, if you want to, telling me how you understand error theory.
The way I understand it is that um, error theorists, it's a form of anti-realism, or they believe in a form of anti-realism. Um, but when people make like moral propositions, they grant that it's truth apt. However, anytime someone makes a moral proposition, they're using false language, making their proposition about morals or normativity, making them all false, no matter what, no matter what moral claim that they're making.
Okay, so that's true. What's the typical account of why those statements are false?
Um, I think, from what I understand, they say that they're false because the person making the moral proposition um, is trying to make a moral proposition that goes beyond their preferences, but the error theorist holds the view that what really makes something truly moral or something would be something um, like something subjective or something along their preferences. However, when people use moral language, they're using a different category than what is actually morality. And so when they refer to a different category, something that the error theorist views as false, then they hold that all moral propositions on that level are false.
Okay, so I think you're on the right track. I would probably sort of clean up some of the terminology and distinctions there, but I think you're on pretty close to just nailing what error theory is. So here's how I understand sort of very standard or mainstream type of error theory. So I see it as the conjunction, the combination of two separate theses. Now, you can make it more complicated than this, but I'm simplifying it. It's a conjunction of a semantic thesis and a metaphysical thesis. The semantic thesis is exactly as you said, that moral claims are truth apps. So it's this claim about what people are doing when they make moral claims. And specifically, it's the claim that, one, moral claims purport to be true or false. They're truth app. They are propositional. So they can be true or false. Now, the reason why that's usually isolated as a specific thesis is because non-cognitivism, this view that moral claims are not truth apt, has emerged very early in the 20th century. It was very popular for a long time. And so that's one part of the semantic thesis. The other part of the semantic thesis, it's okay, so the moral claims can be true or false. And then it's specifically, what are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to refer to objective moral facts. So they attempt to describe or refer to stance-independent moral facts. So if you take a statement like stealing is wrong, what that statement means is stealing is inconsistent with the stance-independent moral facts, or stealing is in violation of the stance-independent moral facts. So that's the semantic thesis. It's a thesis about what moral claims mean. So it's about meaning and what words mean.
Yeah,
then you have the metaphysical thesis, which is that there isn't anything like that. There are no stance-independent facts. And so when you have you have this category, moral claims, all the moral claims try to refer to the objective moral facts, but there aren't any, so all the moral claims are false. So a comparison would be like if someone went around talking about what God wanted. God wants this, God wants that, God doesn't want this, God doesn't want that. Well, if there is no God, God doesn't want or not want anything, so all of those claims would be false. It's the same idea.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I'd disagree with it. But would you say that someone can be an error theorist and hold the thesis, like the semantic thesis, that people are trying to get at what is culturally relative? However, they believe that it's like individual relative. Like they think that moral statements are individually relative, and when they think that most people are trying to get at cultural relativity, could they also be an error theorist and still posit that they're making false claims?
Yes, that would be a type of error theory. It would be a really interesting and cool one. So the error theory there would be that if you take stealing is wrong, what people mean when they're saying stealing is wrong would be something like stealing violates the standards of our culture, but actually nothing is right or wrong relative to cultures. It's only right or wrong relative to the standards of individuals. And so all of those claims would be false. So yeah, that would be an error theory.
Okay. Then yeah, I think I understand it better. I still disagree with it. I guess I think I just have like maybe one more question, or kind of like a request. Whenever I think of metaethics, and me myself, I'm an anti-realist, but I don't. When someone gives or like asks me why I'm an anti-realist, I can only ever really respond with critiques of arguments for moral realism and just deny those. But I don't know how I can like almost justify the fact that kind of justify the thesis of anti-realism. I can only really be agnostic on moral realism or skeptical about moral realism. So I was wondering if maybe you had like maybe a preferable argument for anti-realism as a concept.
Sure, I do, but it's a much tougher case to make. And the reason it's a much tougher case to make is because anti-realism by its very nature is a negative thesis. It's not a thesis about what is true in a direct sense. It's a more of second-order thesis. It's a thesis about other theses. When you have a position like that, the position is reactive. That is, the content of the position is a reaction to other people's positions. And so almost everything that you're going to say in the substantive content of your view, why you hold your view, is about why you don't hold some other view. So it's very hard to make a positive case because it's just part of the very nature of the view that it's a negative thesis. So right off the bat, that's going to put you at, in some ways, a dialectical or a conversational disadvantage, because people may say exactly, and this happens to me too, all you ever do is critique realist arguments. What's your positive case? So part of the positive case would come from an abductive argument. Most people focus on inductive arguments and deductive arguments. There's a lot less focus on abductive arguments. So an abductive argument is roughly something like an inference to the best explanation. Sometimes people distinguish between the two. But very roughly, what you would be doing with this sort of argument is you would want to say, okay, now let's take some set of relevant data, observations, whatever it may be, what the world is like. Now, what is the best explanation for what the world is like between competing hypotheses or alternative positions? Given what we see in the world and given what we know, does moral realism account for it better than moral anti-realism? Do we need to posit moral facts in order to offer the best explanation of things? And if the answer is no, you could have an abductive argument for moral anti-realism. And so this kind of argument would appeal to things like, here would be one way to argue for it. You could argue that moral realism is explanatorily superfluous, that there are no data or observations that are best explained by positing the existence of stance-independent moral facts. Now, that gets you some of the way to a case for anti-realism. Part of the problem with that is that some realists will just say, okay, that's fine. My view of moral realism doesn't involve explaining anything. It doesn't need to explain any observations or data or phenomena. That would be a potential issue. Another possible issue might be that they may argue, depending on how you're pitching this argument, that you're being overly empiricist with the type of argument that you're making. It depends on exactly what we mean by data or observations. There are philosophers that talk about data and observations, and they don't appear to be directly talking. They're not necessarily talking about stuff you could see in a microscope. So then you might turn to something else. So David Enoch has an argument for deliberative indispensability. So David Enoch argues, and this is not an argument for moral realism directly, it's an argument for normative realism. So realism in a more general sense about normativity. And Enoch argues that you need to appeal to normative realism in order to deliberate, that it's deliberatively indispensable. You can't deliberate without it. And so we need to posit it to account. And he has more to say about that. And it's a pretty interesting argument. I don't agree with it. I did do a video. We didn't actually discuss deliberative indispensability in the video, but I do have a discussion with David Enoch. So an abductive argument, I think, would be one of the main ways to go. But largely, you're just at a disadvantage because of the nature of the disagreement being a response to other disagreements. The other thing I would say about this, and this for me is helpful and important in the dialectic. Like what I mean by the dialectic is like the ongoing debate and discussion between realists and anti-realists. So historically, and even to this day, a common way that disputes between realists and anti-realists will begin is with realists saying something like, moral realism is the common sense position. It's the intuitive position. It's the position that seems obvious. It's the position that has some sort of prima facie appeal to it. And so because of that, there is a presumption in favor of realism. Neil Sinclair, a philosopher, has a paper arguing against the presumption in favor of realism, but that's the only paper I've seen arguing against it. By and large, realists often seem comfortable presuming, hey, my position has the upper hand here. It's the default position. I even will literally say it's the default position. And then what they'll say is because it's the common sense, intuitive, default, self-evident, prima facie plausible position, the onus is on the anti-realist to argue against it. Now, if they're doing that and then you argue against it successfully, maybe that should seriously undermine their confidence in their view. But the thing is, I just don't grant the presumption. So here's something that a realist might say, that one of the most popular arguments for moral realism is ethical intuitionism. And that could be combined with something like phenomenal conservatism. And that would look something like this. Hey, we're justified in believing how things seem in the absence of defeaters. So reasons to think that our view is wrong or that some other view that conflicts with our view is right. So the idea would go like this. You're justified in believing how things seem to you in the absence of defeaters. Seems like realism is true. So I'm justified in believing realism is true in the absence of defeaters. And then the realist is putting themselves basically up as like the person on top of the hill, and they win as long as they remain undefeated. And then they just argue that, hey, anti-realist, it's now your job to argue against my view. Yeah, I don't find anything you have to say convincing, so I win. I win by default. Basically, they win as long as they don't lose. And I don't think that we should grant them that presumption. I don't think they win unless they lose. I don't think that they enjoy that sort of presumption. So a big thing for me is to knock that down. And a big part of how I knock that down, when they say it's the common sense position, if they're making the claim that most people are moral realists, that's an empirical claim. What's their evidence for that? So I do research on the psychology of metaethics. I don't think we have good evidence that most people are moral realists. So I attack that. So that gives you a second thing to argue against. If they're arguing that moral realism is intuitive, or there's a presumption in favor of it, or there's a default position, you could check out my other content. I spend probably most of my time arguing against that because I think it's just wrong. So knock down the presumption in favor of realism. Oh, sorry. I said a lot there. Go ahead.
I've watched a lot of your YouTube videos. I think we spoke on Discord before. I don't know if you remember, but my username is Lucario. I'm pretty sure we're mutuals on some of my other accounts.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I talk about this stuff literally every day, so for almost 20 years. So I can't keep track of everybody. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. But yeah, I do really enjoy your content. I think I used to affirm like ethical intuitionism for a while, but then I did start thinking more things about kind of like theoretical virtues like parsimony, and I don't think the default position is going to posit like a really large entity such as like categorical norms, and so I think that was probably like my first step, but then I think the second step to becoming like a committed anti-realist would be more so critiques against like individual arguments for moral realism. But now I think the final step that I think I need to work on is like a solidified justification. But I think I'll probably look into more like abductive arguments, stuff like that. But right now, yeah.
So parsimony would be a part of those abductive arguments. So parsimony is going to be exactly the kind of explanatory virtue you would appeal to when making an abductive argument. So if you're looking into that sort of thing, that's the way to go. And that parsimony would be a factor in explanatory superfluousness. Parsimony. You should remove unnecessary explanatory posits. You don't want your epicycles in your account. And then the idea would be, we really don't need to posit these moral facts. Now, the thing is, what some realists will just say is the problem with removing the moral facts from your explanation is that you're no longer able to account for their very strongly held realist intuitions. Like they have very strong intuitions. And so if you remove those facts from your ontology, it becomes insurmountable to, or at least less plausible to account for their intuitions than if their intuitions are actually tracking the moral facts. Would you have any kind of response to that offhand?
No, I don't think so. I'd probably have to look into it more.
Yeah, I don't know what to say to that. So you end up having to sort of critique the psychology of the realist, and that becomes very, very difficult. Okay, any other questions or anything you want to bring up?
No, that's it. Sorry. Something came up outside. I had to go really quick.
Okay, no problem.
I appreciate your time. I've been writing down some sources that you recommended. I'll probably look into those later, and I might ask you or reach out to you eventually.
Absolutely. Do feel free to message me if you didn't get a name down or something, and I could just send you the references or links or whatever.
All right, absolutely. Thank you.
Alrighty, take care. All right. So I don't have any requests, so I'm going to go through the chat and look at. I see it says 99 plus messages, so it looks like there's probably been a lot of stuff that's been said. Someone a while ago said, "You don't make any sense. Why are you pushing your morals on us if there is no moral truth?" So moral anti-realism is not the view that there's no moral truth. It's the view that there's no stance-independent moral truth. But even if you didn't think there's moral truth, there wouldn't be anything, let's say you're a total nihilist. There wouldn't be anything wrong with you pushing your moral views on other people, just as there wouldn't be anything right with it. So, but there is that. There's also just on my view, nothing about imposing moral standards on other people would be better if there were objective moral facts than if there weren't. I don't think realists have any real advantage there. Who cares if the facts are objective or not? I just don't see why that would be a reason to push them on other people. All right. Someone says, if you had a standard for whiskey that's industry-wide, you could assign what's good and the best. Yeah, you could relative to that standard though. But even if you have some standard, there could be some industry standard and they rate all the whiskeys. And you might still find one that's a 10 out of 10 to not be the tastiest, and a one that's an 8 out of 10 to be tastier. Think of movie ratings. If you go on IMDb, do you think every movie that gets a 9 or a 9.2 or an 8.7 is better than some movie you saw that got a 7.3? I don't think so. Sometimes movies have lower ratings and I actually love the movie, and sometimes they have higher ratings and I didn't much care for them. So, even if there were some sort of established standards, or that, one movie has a bunch of nominations and awards, that doesn't make it better. Better relative to what? Better relative to whatever standards they're using to evaluate it. So what you have there are sort of constructivist procedures, and in those cases, those are still constructed by people and things are good or bad according to those constructed procedures. You're still not getting something that's true independent of some stance or standard or means of evaluation that a person could be free to reject without error. All right. Extreme relativism cannot be applied in the real world of humans. It leads to endless pain. I don't know what extreme realism is. I'm probably not an extreme realist. Someone said thoughts on Alex O'Connor. Already gave some thoughts on Alex O'Connor. I would love to talk to Alex. I really think we could have a great discussion about metaethics, and I would love to share my perspective on why we shouldn't endorse error theory, non-cognitivism, or subjectivism or constructivism, like all the sort of mainstream anti-realist accounts. We should endorse my view, which is anti-realist quietism. Everyone should endorse my view on the matter. All right. So here someone says, if someone robs you, you wouldn't mind because there's no moral truth. So think about this. So I am only denying that there are stance-independent moral facts. I also deny that there are stance-independent gastronomic facts. That is, facts about what food is good or bad independent of my preferences or standards. That doesn't mean I deny that food can be good or bad relative to my standards. So if you're not a gastronomic realist, if you think that whether food is good or bad does turn on your preferences, does that mean that you don't think that food is good or bad? No. You think what it means for food to be good or bad is good or bad relative to your preferences. And, think about, if you are a gastronomic subjectivist, you think food is a matter of preference. If someone served you food that you really hate, like they just covered, maybe you hate blue cheese and they covered it in blue cheese sauce or something, or they serve you rotting garbage, it would be pretty weird to go, well, because you don't think there's an objective truth about whether food is good or bad, there's only your subjective views about what's good or bad, you have no reason to object to eating garbage. It'd be ridiculous. The reason to reject to eat garbage is it tastes bad and you don't want to eat it. That's a perfectly good reason to not eat garbage. So yeah, you just don't need objectivity about normative or evaluative considerations for it to totally make sense to act in accordance with your preferences and values. And the same just holds for morality. You just don't need objective moral truth for it to make sense to act in accord with your moral preferences and values. All right. I like that you have no free will topic better. Oh, I like the you have no free will topic better. Yeah, I'm going to vary the topics. I tried to switch to add the heading up there where I have 3 topics, but I couldn't figure out how to change my background in the middle of a live. There's probably a way to do it, and I'm just goofy and don't know how to do it. That's an objective statement which defeats the argument. I don't know what that was in reference to, but moral anti-realism is the view that there's no objective moral facts. It's not the view that there's no objective facts at all. All right. So if you want to request, if you think that there are objective moral truths, let me know. All right. How do you respond to one has the same value as a rock under atheism because no objective gives you value? I'm not clear on what that would mean. I don't think you need objective facts to give you value. I think valuing is a thing people do. I don't think things like have value. It's not like reality is a video game and each like object has like you click on it and you hit like the little question mark and it's like ding, has 17 units of intrinsic value and something else has 46 units of intrinsic value. Value isn't a property of things. It's a property of our attitude towards the things. So yeah, I just don't like you. I know I value my family more than I value rocks. So my family has more value than rocks because what it means for them to have more value than rocks is that I value them more than rocks. That doesn't mean someone else has to or must value them more than rocks. It doesn't mean they have intrinsic value properties. Oh, someone made a reference to the Pintars. Oh, wait until, okay. All right, someone says, how do you request? There should be a request box. If there isn't, if you click, there should be like a thing on the bottom. Isn't it like guests or something? I don't know if things look differently in other people's interface than mine. All right, let's try to get through these comments. There's so many. Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks for liking the video. And again, I'll say I have a YouTube channel. Just go on YouTube and look up Lance Independent. I also have a blog, also called Lance Independent. I also have a Discord server. I do have a Linktree in my description, and that'll give you a link to all my stuff. So you can go follow, subscribe, follow me everywhere else. Got a Discord server, all the stuff. All right, I see a request, but let me get through a few more comments just so I don't fall too far behind. All right, what's your thoughts on psychological egoism and their morals? That would be too long to address. So Infidel, just ask me that question another time, and we'll take some time. Someone says, wow, philosophers sound goofy. If you're talking about me, I do sound goofy. If you're talking about other philosophers, they sound goofy too. Don Mark's thoughts on doing experimental philosophy of mind along with neuropsychology and neuroscience. That's another question I'm going to have to bank. Let me bring up my guest. I don't want to leave somebody waiting. So I will bring up my guest, and if I get a chance, I'll try to get back to the questions. It doesn't seem likely, though. I'll probably have to go before then.
Hello?
Hey, how's it going?
Lance, what's up, man?
What's going on?
I don't know if you remember, you and I actually had a conversation some time back about realism and anti-realism.
When was that? Was it like months ago or what?
Yeah, it was like, I don't know, like some few months ago or something. I can't remember.
Maybe I'll remember if we start talking about it. I was having more conversations back around December or something like that, so it might have been back then.
Yeah, so I was proposing like a realist argument, and then you came up, and so I was going against like somebody who was an anti-realist, and then they were inaccurately representing the anti-realist position. So then
I remember that. Yeah. Okay, I remember that. Mm-hmm.
And then you corrected them, and then you provided your argument to me after you did that.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. So I will do that. If I see bad arguments against realism, I will go after them. I don't want there to be bad arguments against realism.
Yeah. No, not gonna lie. Like, you gave me a lot to think about. Obviously, you're like light years ahead of me. I'm only 22, so I don't have a PhD or anything like that. I'm just trying to learn as much as possible. But I did have a couple questions for you, not about realism or anti-realism. Are you familiar with scholastic metaphysics at all?
Not that much. Not really.
So, do you know? So I assume you don't know much about like the study of qua being or anything like that.
No, I don't think so. I might not be the person to talk to about that.
Dang, I was gonna ask some questions about that. Okay, so on the topic of realism, are you familiar with Hume's defense?
Which one? So Hume has a number of arguments for his view. He has ethical intuitionism. He has his ontological argument, and he has his argument for moral convergence, among others. But he has, he said quite a bit on the topic.
Yeah, I guess I'm more specifically talking about his probabilistic reasons principle.
I've heard the name, but I don't remember the context in which it was brought up.
So, okay, so I'm gonna try my best to represent his argument the way he represents it. Okay. But basically, he stipulates that this probabilistic reason principle is just a rough idea that like there would be some tact, or like if it was the case that moral facts did exist, that they would provide reasons for why we ought to behave in certain type of ways, and that we like and then he gets into like prudential reasons and stuff like that. Does that kind of ring a bell?
Not really. Yeah, I would have to hear more of what the argument is supposed to be.
So, okay. Maybe I think he provides like an illustration about it. So maybe I'll just provide the illustration, and then you can tell me what you think about it.
Sounds good.
So the illustration is he's talking about prudential reasons. So imagine like an agent buying like a lottery ticket, for example, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if this agent knew that they would win this ticket, then that would be a prudential reason for the agent to buy the ticket, right? So what he's getting at with the probabilistic reasons principle is that if this agent merely had some reason to think that they would win the ticket, then they will order their activities or actions towards buying that ticket. So what do you think about that? This sounds
like it might be part of his ontological proof.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the paper now. Yeah, probabilistic. It's funny. I actually pulled up. I don't know if it will actually show. In fact, let me show this if I can. 1 second.
Yeah.
Will it actually show the screen? No, it's not going to show it. Oh well. So it's just showing my microphone. No. So I was going to show my screen, but what I can promise you, it's not going to show it. Is that when I opened up the paper, literally the first words I saw were the probabilistic reasons principle. And so I see it right here in his paper. So I knew the name rang a bell because it's part of his broader argument for his ontological proof of moral realism. I have seen some criticism of that argument. The main thing I would say about that is my main issue is with the way he's using the concept of reason. So I think the argument never gets off the ground. But anyway, let's dial it back. So probabilistic reasons principle. Okay. Can you go over that with me again?
Yeah, just basically that, that if it was the case that these objective facts do exist, that they would provide a reason for us to behave in certain ways. That's my understanding. I might be given a misrepresentation.
Right. What he's trying, a really rough way of putting the idea that he's trying to argue for is that if we have any reason at all, like if there's even a possibility that we have some reason to comply with the objective moral facts, then we in fact ought to comply with the objective moral facts. And then he's going to argue, unless you're going to say it's literally there's zero probability that there are these objective moral facts that will give you a reason, then you should think that there are these objective moral facts. I think that's not the most accurate way of putting that together. I mean, we could literally read off his argument when he puts it together. Let's see. It's kind of long, though. So this is part of his ontological argument, and I don't think I could just dish out the ontological argument that he puts together. So, I'm looking at part of it here. So the probabilistic reasons principle, if the following conditions hold. If S knew that P, this would provide a reason for S to phi. If S knew that not P, this would provide no reason for S not to phi, and S has some reason to believe that P, then S thereby has a reason to phi. So it would be something like that. My issue with this is the very concept of a reason. I don't know what he means by a reason. What does he mean by that?
Well, no, I'm just, go ahead.
Yeah, so part of the issue is that I take a Humean approach I shouldn't say a Humean approach. My view is closer to a Humean approach than his is, because he rejects Humean approaches. So when I think about reason, I don't think that facts give us reasons, and so I don't even think it makes sense to talk about there being reasons for us to do things independent of our goals and standards. So if there were facts about what I have a reason to do that don't turn on my goals or desires, okay, well, I'm not interested in those. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to comply with those facts that give me reasons. I only act in accordance with my goals and desires. And so, part of my concern with this sort of argument is I think one of the things that's implicit in this argument is a conception of reasons that I simply don't share, and that I think might not be intelligible. And so there wouldn't even be a way for me to evaluate the probability of the argument. I think it's literally meaningless.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. I don't know if I necessarily hold to Humer's defense per se, but I just like to ask questions about this kind of stuff because obviously you've studied this stuff for a while. So what do you think, under your view, what is the most convincing argument for you for the anti-realist position? How would you stipulate anti-realism?
I don't think that there is a straightforwardly strong argument for anti-realism. I just don't think that there is one. My general view is that analytic philosophers focus too much on formalistic arguments. They want everything in syllogistic form, and they want to have this sort of premise one, premise two, conclusion way of knocking things down. That's not my approach to arguing for and against things. When it works, it works. So, if you have some sort of deductive argument that could just say, hey, boom, there's a contradiction in this person's position, here it is. That's fine. That's great. Use deduction when it's the appropriate tool. But I think the sort of a range of cases in which deductive arguments are actually successful is extremely narrow. And really what we have in a lot of these cases are not clashes at the edges or the branches of our views, but clashes that are more fundamental. It's not both my view and the views of Humer about moral realism are downstream of a whole bunch of other background views that we have. Humer and I are not going to share the same views about how to do philosophy, how much stock to put in our intuitions. We're not going to agree on meta-philosophical facts about appropriate methodological procedures to employ. I'm a pragmatist. Humer is almost certainly not a pragmatist. I'm an empiricist. Right. Humer, I can guarantee you, is not an empiricist. He's very explicitly a rationalist. And so Humer and I have very fundamentally different approaches to things. We don't even evaluate evidence and data in the same way at all. And so when our dispute about realism is at the extremity, it's downstream. There's a chain of inference. I think these things, and because of that, I think these other things, and because of that, I think these other things. And all the way at the end of that chain of reasoning, anti-realism just becomes, it's obvious to me, conditional on my background views. And for Humer, realism is obvious to him, conditional on his background views. And so the real battle is not realism and anti-realism, it's actually our meta-philosophies. I don't think Humer would endorse the same views that he does, if he were a pragmatist and if he shared my empirical views about how human psychology works. And I don't know if I would endorse my views. I might endorse his if I didn't have these views, and I could be wrong about them. So, the problem here really is a problem of thinking that we can make progress on issues at the extremity or down, like sort of at the sort of lower level of our philosophical views without addressing the higher level disagreements. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Like I said, like originally I actually came up here to ask you a couple questions about like scholastic metaphysics and that whole field. But so it's obviously like you're going to give more credence to the anti-realist position than you are to the realist position. So what about, why are you unconvinced that there are no moral facts? I'm just curious, like walk me down your line of reasoning.
There's a few reasons. So the first is simply that I don't have realist intuitions in the first place, and as far as I could tell, I never did. So nothing about moral realism strikes me as having any sort of prima facie appeal. There's nothing, I'm not like drawn to the view. So I look out at the world and I don't see any reason to think that there are moral facts. Nothing about what the world is like, nothing about my psychology or the way I experience the world, nothing about my phenomenology or introspection in any way lends itself towards there being stance-independent moral facts. Quite the contrary, as far as I can, to the extent that I introspect and I think about how people use language, how I think people think, how I myself think, what the nature of my experiences are like. All of that to me, if I had to pick something, I would say it screams anti-realism. The way I experience my values, they do feel subjective. They don't feel objective. And so from the very outset, Humer relies to a significant extent on phenomenal conservatism. He's an advocate of phenomenal conservatism where the view is, hey, if something seems true, you're justified in believing how it seems, unless you have good reason to believe otherwise. Well, for me, it seems like anti-realism is true. And so on Humer's view, as far as I understand, I would be justified in being an anti-realist in the absence of defeaters. So Humer and I, at the very least, would start from the same point. And then the only question would be, are there defeaters? In other words, like, are the arguments for realism good enough to move me away from that sort of initial anti-realist position? So one way to frame this is the way I would prefer to frame it, is in terms of priors, like Bayesian priors. So I start out with, where I'm at. I start thinking about this issue and I go, given everything I know about what the world is like, how likely do I think it is that some type of non-naturalist moral realism is true? And the answer is extremely unlikely, maybe 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million, 1 in a billion. It's really low. And then if someone comes along and says, okay, I understand that's your starting point, but if we want to get you to realism, here's going to be the arguments for realism. And then they present them. And they present Humer's ontological arguments. I've seen some pretty good criticisms of it, but I also have my own issues with the meaningfulness of certain key terms. That argument doesn't move the dial for me very much. Then you have the companions and guilt argument. That argument doesn't move the dial for me anywhere because I'm already a global normative anti-realist, and I don't think there's any problems with that. You look at Enoch's deliberative indispensability argument. I don't find that compelling. You look at Humer's ethical intuitionist argument. Well, I don't have those intuitions, so that argument actually backfires and gives me a reason to be an anti-realist. So when I systematically go through the arguments for moral realism, none of them are convincing to me. And not only are they not convincing, I find them so easy to respond to most of the time. In fact, I think the ontological argument is one of the harder ones to respond to. But I just don't find any of the arguments even remotely convincing. Now, that doesn't mean I think that everyone else, therefore, has to be an anti-realist. People will make fun of a atheist counter-apologist where they're like, I'm not convinced. And Christian apologists will rightly point out, okay, well, the fact that you're not convinced by any of these arguments doesn't mean they're not good arguments. Fair enough. Maybe these are good arguments, but I haven't been convinced by them. So if we're talking about why I believe what I believe, it's because I have no particularly good reason to think realism is true in the first place. I've spent a lot of time looking at arguments for moral realism, and I don't find any of them convincing. And my best understanding of what the world is like, there's simply no need to posit the existence of objective moral facts. I would add on top of that I do endorse something. It's a little hard to develop and argue for it, but you could call it a sort of cultural evolutionary debunking argument. And that is an argument. So once we address all of those other reasons why I'm an anti-realist, there's still the fact that 62% of professional philosophers, at least according to the Phil Paper survey, endorse moral realism. Now, philosophers are really damn smart people. on average, these are people that know how to write, they know how to think, they know how to argue. And if a majority of them are moral realists, that should give me a little bit of pause, and it does. So I need to explain, on my view, given my commitments, why so many smart people would be mistaken about this. And that is a burden that I think that I carry. And what I have to argue, on my view, is why they would all be similarly misguided in the same sorts of ways. And so my argument for that turns on arguing that the methods that philosophers in contemporary analytic philosophy are using to arrive at their positions are flawed methods. So it's like a garbage in, garbage out scenario. And that these philosophers, in virtue of shared exposure to the same canon of largely Western philosophical work that's been heavily influenced by Christianity, I think that a legacy of Christian and Western philosophical influence has caused philosophers to share the same cultural biases that are prompting them to think of the worlds in these Manichaean terms. There's a cosmic division between good and evil, and I think that we've spent 3,000 years of our philosophy and our culture being saturated in this view. And I think that secular approaches to philosophy are fairly recent. They've only emerged in the early 20th century. And I think that we're still seeing the residual effects of Christianity and Western philosophy causing the majority of philosophers to think in terms of this division of good and evil. And I think it's something that's sort of culturally inculcated in them from a very young age. So that is roughly why I think they are caused to believe in a sort of quasi-religious good and evil that's external to themselves, even though there's no particularly good reason for thinking such a thing.
Interesting. So under your framework, how do you account for like a convergence of values?
Yeah, so I think that convergence in moral values can simply be explained by cultural transmission. So, you have people start speaking the same languages, people start trading with one another, people start interacting with one another. Right now, around the world, there's over 6,000 languages, but many of those languages are going extinct. The speakers of those languages, there's just when one culture moves into another area, sometimes there's some languages that are considered like higher prestige. Like if people in power, it will give someone advantages to speak the language of the society has more power. So that's one factor. So that is causing the gradual dissolution of less prominent languages. So what's causing convergence in the language over time? A lot of cultural and sociological factors are causing that. None of that means that, like, for instance, like English is a common language around the world. There's like English isn't the correct language to speak. That would be like absurd. So convergence in what languages people speak isn't driven by the languages being correct or not. And I think it's the same thing with morality. I will give another gastronomic example. If you look all over the world right now, you will find in most countries, you'll find McDonald's, you'll find Coca-Cola, you'll find people wearing jeans, you'll find people wearing baseball caps, you'll find people like fried chicken, people like boba tea came over to the U.S., sushi came over to the U.S. So there's all these onions, potatoes, and peppers went all over the world. A lot of vegetables that were in Mexico and South America originally have traveled all over the world. They made it over to parts of East Asia. And so culinary traditions have spread pizza is everywhere. Pizza's freaking everywhere. Everybody loves pizza. And, take tomatoes. I think tomatoes were originally from Mexico or Central America, but they're all full of, they're in Italian food. So you have gastronomic convergence. And I don't think that's a good reason to think that there are objective gastronomic facts. So I think the same thing with morality, that over time, as societies interact with one another, as some cultures dominate, wipe out, eradicate, or supplant other cultures, that societies become more homogenous. And this greater homogeneity, greater interaction leads to basically cultures blending or disappearing, and it leads to values being shared between those societies. Now, there are also probably more complicated factors when it comes to morality. So as you have a larger and larger society, a more globalized society, you have a lot less people living in isolated communities. People are interacting with one another more. So you get stuff like greater and greater exposure and frequent exposure to people with different moral standards and values. Well, one thing that happens when you interact with people with different moral standards and values is there are conflicts between them. And so one way of resolving conflicts is for people to adopt similar values, but people might also stop being as hostile and aggressive towards people with different values and standards. And so what this might lead to is a sort of less, sorry, go ahead.
Why do you think there's conflict in the first place?
Well, if one society they're very against abortion, and another society they're in favor of it. One society thinks being gay is morally bad and should be condemned, and another doesn't. When that happens, and people want to implement policies or they treat people poorly because of differences in their standards and values, obviously that those are sources of conflict. So part of what happens when you have societies increasingly interacting with one another is conflicts get resolved, and they get resolved. It looks like they tend to be getting resolved in a way where people are sort of expanding their moral circles. They're getting more tolerant, more liberal in the broad sense of liberality over time. And this is largely something that is the result of a cooperative means of resolving conflicts. And so I think that the moral values that we're seeing are a sort of byproduct of the social forces that are driving, disparate communities in the past to interact with one another more now.
Okay. What do you make of, I'm sure you're familiar with the argument from supervenience. What's your opinion on that?
Don't have much of a view on that.
Okay. And under your framework, how do you account for categorical reasons?
I don't think there are categorical reasons. I actually think the idea of a categorical reason is literally meaningless. I don't think it makes sense to talk about categorical reasons.
You think there are epistemic reasons?
No, I don't think that there's any categorical normative reasons at all, not just in morality, but in any normative domain.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I just wanted to come up and ask a few questions and, learn a couple things. So thank you for having that conversation.
Yeah, awesome. I don't get very long answers, but I appreciate your patience with me.
No, it's good. Look, man, I love learning from people who obviously know, like you obviously know way more about this stuff than I do, and I love learning.
But note, I don't. There's a lot of stuff I don't know. So you were bringing up some like scholastic philosophy stuff that I don't know a whole lot about. What I can say is I know more about the moral psychology than a lot of the stuff. I don't talk about it as much, but I am not the most knowledgeable person that you could talk to about metaethics. There's a lot of very knowledgeable professors and teachers out there. It's just they're not on TikTok. I wish they were, because then I would be learning from them.
No, that's fine. Yeah. My camp more has to deal with like that sort of things, like the scholastic stuff. But yeah, it's interesting, man. I'm still kind of okay. What do you think about divine subjectivism?
Can you tell me what you mean by divine subjectivism?
Well, I mean, they're just gonna say that like morality is indexed to like God's.
Oh no, I can't hear you. What happened?
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I got a 20% notification, but yeah, they're just gonna say like that like morality is just indexed to God's preferences, or they're just gonna gonna walk kind of like,
so it's like some type of divine command theory that's like explicitly anti-realist.
Yeah, exactly. It just walks you down that line.
Yeah, I mean, so there would be the question of whether if someone had a semantic thesis, which is that when we make moral claims, the claims are about God's preferences. That doesn't seem true for most people, at least. Could be true for some people. So that would be an empirical question. And then the metaphysical question would turn on, is there a God? And, if our language isn't used to refer to God's preferences, then the semantic thesis would be wrong. If there isn't a God, then the metaphysical thesis would be wrong. So it would be conditional on what part of that argument that we're considering. But I don't think that there's anything sort of like conceptually incomprehensible about divine subjectivism. I don't think gods exist. And I don't think that if a God did exist, that construing morality in terms of that God's preferences would be like the best account. So, I mean, not sure what else there is to say about it, unless you have other specific questions about it.
Upon your analysis, why are you convinced that a God doesn't exist?
Oh, that's a much bigger question. I mean, I would say a lot of the same things that I would say about moral realism, which is that it's like an abductive thing. And so basically, my approach to things is if I start out with nothing in my ontology or nothing that I think exists, and I build up what does exist, well, I start positing things in order to explain things. And, so I think the best explanation for why it seems to me that there's trees over there when I look out my window is that there are in fact trees outside of my window. And so when you have that completed model of the world, that model is constantly updating. There's my model of what's in the world. I think the earth exists, I exist, you exist, computers exist, my phone exists, all sorts of stuff exists. But at no point in trying to form an accurate model of the world is there any point where I'm like, I can't explain this data, I can't explain these observations, but you know what would explain them? If a God existed. And then you posit God as an explanation, and that ends up being the best explanation. And there are arguments that God is the best explanation for various sorts of things. So you have Baggett's argues that God is the best explanation for moral realism, but I don't think moral realism is true. You have like fine tuning. There's other sorts of things where proponents of theism will say, hey, this set of observations or data is best explained by positing a God. And I haven't found any instance where I think the best explanation is God. So it's largely that God is explanatorily superfluous.
What about the argument for motion?
I don't know. I don't know what it is.
Basically, yeah, I won't go super deep into it, but basically the argument for motion is that if it's the case that it seems like change is a real feature of the world, and under the Aristotelian analysis, they're going to say that change is an actualization of potential. So he's going to say that there are two modes of being. He's going to make a distinction. This is what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about scholastic metaphysics. So Aquinas talks about this in his study of qua being. He's going to say that things either exist. Well, he's first going to say that things exist in a state of composition, and that these composite objects either are going to exist in a state of actuality or potentiality. And that process of going from a state of potency to a state of actuality is a kind of change, and that there's a concurrence of actualization of potentials, which ultimately leads you down to like a pure act. That's the basic overview or analysis of that argument. What do you think about that?
So it seems like the argument is steeped in a lot of metaphysics that I don't share and I'm not very familiar with. And so I really just wouldn't be able to analyze that in real time. That's the sort of thing that we would either need to have a long discussion where you walk me through the steps and the background, or I'd have to just sit down and like have a couple of reading assignments before I could manage that. So
there's a lot.
I'd be happy to have that conversation, but I don't think it would be an interesting conversation to have on my live. Especially because it would be, I mean, it might be useful and instructional to reveal how fabulously ignorant I am of enormous swaths of philosophy. So it might be useful for that purpose. But I think that's something that we should table for another time and talk about when we've got the time to do it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like you said, there's a lot of underlying metaphysics, obviously, that need to be explained, but that gets you to the argument. But yeah, maybe we can have that argument, or we can have that conversation, I mean, some other time or something like that. But thanks for having me up.
Yeah. Okay. Let's do it another time. Thanks so much for being here.
Sir.
All right. Take care. So far I'm having like friendly conversations with people. I haven't had any, I'm so used to watching Danny's live. Sorry, I'm putting the charger back in. It's funny. He said he got a 20% notification right when my phone hit 20%. Now it's at 19. And I'm trying to balance it. I'm going to need some kind of stand for my phone for doing this because you see, dang it. I don't have a way to stand up the dang phone. What do I put it on? I don't have anything. I have such a minimalist setup in my house that it's just sitting on the microphone, but I have the charger plugged into the bottom. So then it's balancing on the charger cord, which obviously doesn't work very well. So I'm going to need to figure this out because I guess I'll just hold the dang phone. All right. Let me try to go through the comments and see what's going on here. There's so much. Yeah, it's funny. I heard probabilistic reasons principle, and I'm like, that sounds like it's part of the ontological argument. But Hume's ontological argument it's weird, it's interesting, and it's a little complicated. It's a cool paper. I'm really critical of Hume's views, but that is a cool paper. And as critical as I am of Hume's views, like I don't accept ethical intuitionism at all. Hume's often very concise, very clear in explaining what he means, and has presented 3 major arguments in the recent literature, and that's more than most people I can think of. So some philosophers might, Terence Cuneo has the companions in guilt argument. Of course, that doesn't mean other people aren't involved in presenting cases for and against these views. But you have Enoch's deliberative indispensability. But Hume's got the ontological argument, the convergence argument, and ethical intuitionism. I think it's easiest for me to respond to ethical intuitionism. I would argue that, even if we accept phenomenal conservatism, I don't have realist intuition, so we stand in a sort of symmetric relation epistemically, at least on that point, like all else being equal. And then it's just going to come down to the other arguments. So at best, I see ethical intuitionism as a sort of saying, hey, if you've got priors in favor of realism, then even if there's arguments against realism, you might still end up having higher credence in realism, which just strikes me as like a descriptive fact. I don't think that gets you very far in discussions. So I don't think ethical intuitionism is a good way to get you to realism. Not as a feature of public discourse. It's not a good way of persuading people like me of realism. And I'm justified in not being a realist on those grounds alone because I don't have the intuitions in the first place. So I think ethical intuitionism is probably the easiest for me to respond to. Convergence, I think this is another case where it's an abductive argument. So the argument for moral convergence is an abductive argument. It's an argument that the best explanation for why moral standards, people have converged on similar moral standards, is that they are discovering what the moral facts are. And I just don't think that's the best explanation. So in that case, I just think it's a worse explanation than non-moral realist explanations. And then you have the ontological argument, and that one has a lot of steps. It has a lot of like terminology that humor has to propose. And so it's a little harder to deal with that in real time. It is definitely something I need to go through and sort of prepare responses to. But part of the main issue is that he's appealing to a concept of reasons that I don't share. And so I think that the argument is either an enthymeme in that it's relying on background assumptions about the nature of reasons that I don't share, or there's probably other internal and structural problems with the argument anyway. But that's not the route I would take. I would just take the route of saying, hey, I'm not even sure that you technically have an argument here if at least one of the premises is appealing to concepts that I worry aren't meaningful. Because if one of the sentences isn't meaningful, then it's not truth apt. If it's not truth apt, it's not a proposition. If it's not a proposition, then it's not technically an argument. So, you do have that issue there. And so I think where humor and I would come down on is I just am not going to grant that his use of the term reason is meaningful. So that would be a pretty big issue. All right. So I am going to take a little bit of a break. Do request if you disagree, and I think I might go for just another 15 minutes if you get someone to request. Otherwise, I'll make some final remarks and close things out. So I will be back in a moment. So do request if you disagree with me, but we might have to keep it short. All right, I am back, and I do see one request. This will be the last one.
Hello?
All right, hey, how's it going? Do you disagree with the prompt up above, or you want to talk about something else?
Yeah, I disagree with it. I was gonna ask you a question.
Sure.
Do you think rape is objectively wrong?
So this is the, first of all, can't say that here. So try to avoid that language.
Oh, my bad.
So the problem with this sort of question, and this is something that I've written rather extensively about, is the problem of what I call normative entanglement. So when you ask that question, like, is some very terrible thing objectively wrong? The problem is that you're entangling a normative question instead of a meta-ethical question. If you're presenting it as a yes or no question, the problem is that there's an asymmetry in what's meant by a yes response and what's potentially implied by a no response. So if you're saying, is X objectively wrong? And someone says yes, they're affirming simultaneously both that it's wrong and that it's objectively wrong. And so that wraps up what their position is in a clear and unambiguous way. The problem is that if they say no, that's actually ambiguous between at least three things. It could mean that they think it's they think some things are objectively wrong, but that particular thing is not objectively wrong. In that case, they don't think it's morally wrong. So that's telling you that they're a realist, but that they don't agree with that thing being wrong normatively. It's also possible that they don't think that there's objective moral facts, but they do think that the thing in question is wrong, just not objectively wrong. And then there's a third possibility, which is that they both reject moral realism and they reject that the thing is morally wrong. And so that would be a no to sort of both questions. And so in other words, a yes is something like a yes and a yes. It's a yes to the meta-ethical question and a yes to the normative question. But a no could be a yes and a no and a yes, or a no and a no. And if you say no, it's ambiguous what you mean between those three possibilities. The problem is that when you pose a question where you're embedding the meta-ethical question inside of a normative question, if a person simply says no, it could be leveraged to imply that they don't hold a normative standard of opposing the action in question. So if you say, is X objectively wrong, and they say no, it can make it sound like the person does not think the action is wrong. And so I'm very much opposed to that type of question. I think it's a kind of trick question. It's a kind of complex question that is used to imply that moral anti-realists are terrible people with awful moral views, even though that doesn't follow. So if you're
So
asking me, if you're asking me if I think some action is wrong and it's some horrible thing like what you mentioned, of course I think it's morally wrong and horrible and bad. But what I don't like is when that's wrapped up in asking if it's objectively bad to give the impression that I am not equally as opposed to the action in question as a realist.
okay, so then let me try to understand. So your stance is that you do think it's wrong, but you believe off of your subjective view that it's wrong, and you don't believe that there is anything that could be objective when it comes to morality, correct?
That's right. And so, another thing to point out about that is it's a little weird to even ask the question. Like if I said, I don't think that there like numbers exist, it's a little weird to say, okay, so you don't think four exists?
No, I think
It just follows from that.
I disagree. I think that it's such an outlandish claim to claim that no, it is not objectively wrong, because I believe that people are born with an innate objective morality within certain regards, right? That's why when we look at a psychopath, we can see something physically altered within his brain that leads him to believe that murdering someone isn't bad, or unaliving. I don't know if I can use that word.
You probably
Unaliving.
can't. Yeah, so be careful with the
Isn't
language.
bad.
And yeah, I'll ask that we avoid the like especially bad examples. We could just talk about really bad things. We know what we're talking about. We don't have to mention them specifically.
Okay, sure. So in that regard, right? Because I guess I'll clarify my position. I'm a Muslim, and
Oh no,
within
I'm not hearing sound. Are you there?
yeah, can you hear me?
Suddenly the sound cut out. Give me one moment. Maybe my headphones are not working. Hello, hello.
Hello.
I am not hearing you. So everyone there is saying that they could hear him, but I cannot. Say something again.
Hello, hello, hello.
Oh, I have an idea about what happened. Give me one moment. Cool. All right. I'm back
Can you
and I
hear
should
me?
be able to hear you now. Sorry, you were saying?
All right. So I was saying that I believe that everyone is born with an innate objective morality within certain regards, right? Like I believe those super bad things that I'm not going to say, I believe that everyone is born without having to be taught that those things are bad. They know it's bad, right? And that ties to, I guess I'll clarify my position. I'm a Muslim, and within the Islamic belief, we believe some people are born with something called a fitrah. So they're born with an innate belief, right? And that innate belief is tied to the objective morality, as in they're able to see an objective truth to what is wrong and right when it comes to certain things, such as those terrible things I've mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
So,
so there's a few things to say here. I mean, one is that psychopathy, it would be characterized by lack of empathy, poor impulse control. It's sometimes associated with other sorts of traits. Sometimes people think of like sadism, like someone that takes pleasure in other people's suffering or harming animals or something like that. So all of those are distinct descriptive qualities that you could like look at a person and observe that about their behavior. When a person denies moral realism, that has absolutely nothing to do with the person being a psychopath. So I don't think there's objective moral facts, but it's very likely that you and I have very similar views about the sorts of things that are bad. Like we're against people harming other people for fun. We're against cruelty. We're against dishonesty. We probably share similar views about what's good. Like courage is a good thing. Being honest is a good thing. And so I share very similar normative moral standards. I just don't share the same view about the metaphysical characteristics of those standards. So like I don't think that morality comes from God. I don't think that we have an innate sense of right and wrong. I actually think that we acquire our moral beliefs from our culture. I do think that evolution influences and shapes that to some degree. But that doesn't mean that I'm any more disposed towards like vicious or bad behavior than anybody else because I don't share the same philosophical views. So that'd be the first thing I would say. Do you have something to say about that?
So I'm just trying to understand your position. So you don't agree with the statement that people are born being able to realize that these very terrible things are very terrible? You believe
That's
that
right.
this is
I
something
don't think
has
that
to be
people
learned?
I don't think that people have an innate sense that certain things are right or wrong.
Okay, interesting. So, okay. So when it comes to morality then, and I'm assuming you're not religious then, correct?
I'm not religious. I'm an atheist.
Okay. So how do you differentiate what is good and bad if in your worldview everything is just comprised of the same atoms?
Well, so I'm not a physicalist, although I have no problem with saying things are made up of atoms. So the way I go about figuring out what's right or wrong is largely a sort of consultation and reflection process, where I consider my own standards and values in relation to what the world is like, and like how my actions and other people's actions, like what kind of consequences they have in the world. Generally speaking, what kind of world I would like to live in is a world where there is more happiness and well-being and liberty and fairness and people living the sorts of lives they want to live, and less suffering and misery and unfairness and things that I would consider bad happening. And it's largely predicated on my own attitudes, values, and preferences. And I think that this, as a matter of descriptive fact, is generally true of most other people too, whether or not they're moral realists. I think in a lot of cases, moral realists, there's an extraordinary correlation between their personal subjective attitudes about what's right and wrong and what they think the moral facts are. And so I think in many cases, people are actually sort of, the reasoning is inverted. They have whatever values they have, and then they're realists about those values. So I think if history had gone very differently, and like one or another of like these horrible dictatorial regimes that have emerged in society had like conquered the world, that the people in that world could be moral realists and then just think it's obvious that the terrible things that they think are okay are okay. And I think it's because they were enculturated to think that those things were okay. So I don't think that we just automatically track what's objectively right or wrong. I think that what we think of as right or wrong is heavily influenced by our culture, and I'm no different than that.
Okay, so then if you were born, like, let's say 200 years ago, would you believe that your moral standard would be completely different than it is right now?
So part of your moral standards are going to be shaped by individual differences and other sorts of factors like that. But yeah, my standards would probably be very different. There's a certain sense in which I don't even know if it would make sense if I were enculturated in a society living 200 years ago to even think of myself as the same person. I mean, it's really going to depend on what we mean by the same person. Like if my standards and values shifted so much that I was like a vicious, violent, sadistic person, I mean, like there'd be certain senses in which I'm the same person, but it certainly wouldn't be a person I would identify with or want to be.
Okay, so since I'm a Muslim, right, and Islam came about 1400 years ago, and the morality within Islam goes against the morality of that time, right? And if the morality of that time was seen as all good, like treating slavery. I don't know if I can say that. Sorry.
I don't know either. Chat, can you help us out here? Let's avoid it.
Okay, so that thing that I just mentioned, right? That was seen as a generally okay thing to mistreat these people, right? But then Islam came about and said, no, you cannot mistreat these people. So if at that time everyone's seen this as a good thing, since this is how society has taught them, then how could it make sense from a subjective moral standpoint for something to come along and say, no, it's wrong, and everyone to suddenly shift into that? That's why I think it ties into my belief that innately everyone does believe it's wrong. They believe in objectively it's wrong. Even though they may go along with it because of society, they still have the objective standpoint of saying this is objectively wrong.
So the first thing to just say is that you could be right, that people have an innate sense of what's right or wrong. What I will note is that there's a difference between people having an innate sense of like the normative. So if we make a distinction between metaethics, which is about the abstract question of whether the moral values that we have are objective or relative or something else, that's a separate question from the normative content, like someone thinking slavery is wrong, slavery is not wrong, stealing is wrong, stealing is not wrong. Those are normative moral questions. Even if people had an innate shared sense of the normative moral values, that wouldn't entail that they have an innate sense that those standards are objectively right or wrong. So for instance, lots of people may have a shared sense that certain types of food taste good. People all over the world like French fries, and people all over the world don't like eating rusty nails. But that doesn't mean that they think that French fries are objectively tasty. So it would be a separate question whether people have innate predisposition to think certain things are right or wrong, and an innate predisposition to think that those things are objectively right or wrong. And in both cases, you could be right. I do take that to be an empirical question. Like it's a question we would have to like go do psychological research to actually find out, do people have an innate sense of moral rightness and wrongness? And is it objective? So my own background, just to say a little bit about what I do. So my PhD is in psychology, and I actually specialize specifically in the question of whether or not people that are not philosophers are moral realists or not. That's the psychological research that I do. What I can tell you just right off is we don't know the answer to whether people have an innate sense of objective rightness or wrongness. There's not enough data. So part of the problem with that research is that almost all the research is done in the United States or the Western world. And there is a massive problem in psychology. Psychology has a bunch of other problems too. But one of the big problems is researchers just don't do enough cross-cultural research. So we don't know what people think about metaethics in South Korea or Indonesia or Nigeria because studies there haven't been done. So I don't know if people have this sense or not. I feel like that's an empirical question. What do you think?
Well, once again, within my Islamic belief, I do believe people have an empirical sense of what is right and wrong. And just so I can clarify, because you said a lot, so I just want to.
Yeah, sorry, I do say a lot. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's fine. But you're saying that even if we did assume that people had the innate belief of a morality, it wouldn't prove it's objective, correct?
No, I'm not saying that, although I do think that wouldn't prove that it's objective. I'm saying that if people have an innate sense, so if it's like just part of people's brains from the time they're born, that when they grow up, they're going to say, these things are good, these things are bad, like these things are right, these things are wrong. That wouldn't mean that they have an innate sense that these things are objectively good and objectively wrong. Those are separate things.
So from your worldview, would there be a way, any evidence you could be provided for you to be able to accept an objective morality, or do you believe it's impossible to prove one?
It's going to depend very much on the particular conception of objective morality. So I don't have a huge problem in principle with certain types of naturalist realism. I'm not going to get into those distinctions today. I always spend like a freaking hour trying to explain what they are. I do have a problem with non-naturalist views of morality because I worry that they are predicated on such fundamental confusions that they're not meaningful. It would be like if someone said, hey, do you think like bibbity bibbity boo is true? I would need to know what that means. And if it's not meaningful, then I can't even assign a probability to it being true. And so the kinds of moral realism that I see in the academic literature fall roughly into two categories. One category are these accounts that I think give up too much of the features of a meaningful account of realism, and they end up just being trivial. So you get these naturalist accounts that are like moral facts or facts about what increases cooperation in human societies. Well, I do think there's facts about what increases cooperation in societies. A law against stealing is going to increase cooperation in a society, but that's a descriptive fact. It's not telling me what I need to do. So those accounts are just out because I think they give up too much of the important features. The other accounts will say something like, I ought not to steal independent of whether I want to or not. And when I ask people what they mean by that, the non-naturalists, they're not able to tell me in a way that I find convincing. And so I don't even think those accounts mean anything. So yeah, I think that they're actually not possible, conditional on me being right about their meaningfulness.
So I do agree that if from an atheistic standpoint, it is impossible to prove an objective morality. So that's where I think if I were to try to, talk to you about an objective morality, I would first try to prove, my first attempt would be to prove God is real rather than proving the morality first. Because if we just both stand on God's not real, then we both would agree objective morality isn't real. So, I don't want to go too deep into that because that's a whole nother argument, like a whole nother topic. So I think I'm just gonna, leave it on that. But
okay. Well, if you liked having this conversation, I very much enjoyed it, and I liked hearing your perspective on this. If you would like to talk about that another time, I do sometimes talk about religion as well, and it'd be great to talk to you again.
Sure. I'll see. If your live pops up, I'll join some other time.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks so much for being here. All right. Take care. I did say that was my last one, but one person in the chat is asking to come up, so we'll see what they have to say.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, what's up, Lance? I don't know if you remember me. We've talked actually like many, many times. I don't know if you recognize my voice.
I am having a terrible time of people saying, I don't know if you remember me, and I literally am not remembering anybody. One person that came up a little earlier, I vaguely recalled a conversation I think I had back in December with them. But one thing I tell people, one is I usually don't pay that much attention who I'm talking to. I'm very sorry. I just kind of just talk to whoever.
No, it's no problem.
So there is that. The other is just that I have these conversations every single day. So before I was on TikTok, I was just talking about this on Discord and YouTube and in person and bothering my wife about it. So I have so many conversations, I can't keep track of them all, and I lose track of who I said what to.
No, that's fine.
So, but how's it going? Good to see you again.
What's up?
Even though I don't remember.
That's good. Yeah, so I mean, I'm agnostic as to whether morality is objective.
Mhm.
As to my belief, I have Bayesian considerations for why I would like reject objective morality, namely that that things are equally, like from my experience, we can equally explain things without like views of Platonism, in which we're not making like more like metaphysical commitments to like substances and stuff like that. But I don't know if that I would even say that that's a strong motivation, given that like things like moral expressions are like metaphysically queer. um I'm curious, do you maybe have like a deductive argument for um anti-realism?
Not really, and I don't think you could give a deductive argument for anti-realism. And part of the reason for that is because anti-realism is a response to a range of philosophical positions, each of which there are different explanations of what the position even is, much less what the arguments for the position for it are. So, for instance, if you're an error theorist and you think that ordinary moral claims are committed to there being, for instance, non-natural moral facts, then there aren't non-natural moral facts because of like Mackey's argument, saying, hey, there's something really weird about these kinds of facts. They're metaphysically really bizarre, and we should reject them from our ontology. But people think that they have those things exist and they don't. Okay, well, note then that that's only really an argument that's going to refute non-naturalist accounts of realism. It's not going to refute naturalist accounts of realism. So even if you had a completely successful deductive argument based on error theory, it would at best only be a critique. It would only like successfully establish that non-naturalist accounts are wrong. It wouldn't establish that naturalist accounts are wrong. It might also fail to establish that like Scanlon and Parfit, certain sorts of deflationary accounts that don't have the same sort of metaphysical commitments are wrong. So it's only going to target like, so basically it'd be like if someone said, hey, what's your argument for, do you have an argument for why fruits taste bad? It'd be a little bit weird because you would have to have a different argument for why each different fruit tasted bad. That would depend on the specifics of that particular fruit. And it's the same thing here. So you would need like a bunch of different syllogisms, and you need a different one for every unique type of realism.
So I guess maybe if I can try and narrow it down, do you have an argument particularly for like anti-realism about non-natural morality?
Something like one. So roughly what I endorse is what I call the anti-realist trilemma, which is that all versions of moral realism are trivial, false, or unintelligible. And the sort of main argument, I don't know if I'll be able to like give an instantaneous modus ponens because I don't typically do that, but it would be something roughly like this. If the concepts necessary for non-naturalist moral realism to be true are unintelligible, then non-naturalist realism is not true. The concepts necessary for it are unintelligible, therefore it's not true. Something like that.
Okay.
So it would be something, and then that, of course, someone would say, okay, but why should we accept that conditional? Why should we think that the premise 2 is true? And then I would just need to give you other syllogisms. So basically what I would need to do to show that I'm right about the non-naturalist accounts is to give an account of meaning and argue for that account, like what it would mean for certain terms or phrases to be meaningful. Then I would need to argue that if moral realism relies on meaningless terms and concepts, then it's not true, or we can't affirm one way or the other, like it's meaningless. So I would need to give an account of meaning, and then I would need to show how realism is kind of committed to things that aren't meaningful according to that account of meaning, and that's like a very tough thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, morality is like very far from my expertise. I actually read like nothing on it. But I'm kind of, at least being able to reach you, I think I'm far more interested in talking the subject. I have you added on Discord. Maybe, I know you got to leave too. Maybe another time we can talk a little bit more in depth on it, because I am interested.
Absolutely. I can say something very briefly about this, and then I'm going to head out. So very briefly, Basically, my concern is that a lot of the terms and concepts that are sort of foundational to non-naturalist realist accounts, they'll appeal to the notion of a normative reason or an external reason. They'll say something like in virtue of the stance independent moral facts, they give you a reason to not do things, and you have that reason independent of your goals or standards or values. Now, if you try to look at what they mean by having a reason, I think that they're not able to explain what they mean by that. And in some cases, in fact, in my experience, most of the time, they'll say, yeah, I'm not able to explain what I mean by that. And then they'll just say, but that's not a problem. Some terms and concepts are unanalyzable, meaning that you can't offer an explanation that's not in terms of synonyms or some sort of like circular loop that doesn't really explain what they mean. So they'll just say, yeah, effectively their meaning isn't communicable, but they're still meaningful. And so when it comes to that point in the dialectic, what we're dealing with is a position where the position is turning on concepts, and that people that are appealing to these positions are employing concepts that they literally cannot explain what the concepts mean. The concepts are incommunicable. And so my problem is that I don't think that there are incommunicable concepts. I certainly don't have the concepts that they claim to have. And I have concerns with them claiming to have concepts. They can't explain what the concepts mean. And then they say that their position is a sort of an entailment of the concepts, or is constituted by the concepts. To give you an example, imagine if I said moral anti-realism is true because all the florps flurp. And you ask me, what does it mean to say all the florps flurp? And I say, it's not communicable. I can't tell you. You either get it or you don't. There's that famous thing about jazz, like if you have to ask, you'll never understand, something like that. That's the position I stand in relation to the non-naturalist accounts. They're using terms. I ask them what they mean. They can't tell me what they mean. What am I supposed to do at that point? What do you do? There's something funny there. There's something off. And typically what's happened a lot of the times is they'll say, well, maybe you don't get the concepts because you're conceptually impoverished. Maybe you don't get it because you have brain damage. Maybe you're lying and you really do have the concepts and you're pretending not to. So I'll get a lot of stuff like that. And it's like, okay, well, I know I'm not lying, so that's not going to be very effective. Okay, maybe there's something wrong with my brain. Okay, well, I'm happy to help. If they want to throw me into an fMRI and scan my brain and point to the problems with my brain, I will volunteer for that procedure. They don't even need to pay me. I'll donate to the procedure, but none of them are doing that research. So they'll throw out stuff like that, but at that point, I think they're in a pretty weak position. And that's where I think things stand. And I think largely the position has survived because no one's shed a light on how, you have people saying, hey, I have these special concepts and I can't tell you what they mean, and that's not a problem. That there's something weird there.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Sorry, that's like one of my biggest issues, so I get real excited about it. But yeah,
I would actually love to talk about that. Yeah. I don't know. I guess we would both have to time we're both free. But yeah, I'll reach out to you in DMs. We can talk about
Sounds good. Just get in touch. All right. So I will see you later, and I got to go make dinner. So everybody, I am going to head out of the live for now. My family is here. I hear my dogs running around. Got to go feed the dogs and got to go do dinner. So I will see everybody later, and that was a lot of fun. So take care.